Lecture 3, November 16th, 1965. Whether negative dialectics is possible. 3. Today the concept of positivity, as an abstraction, has become ideology. Criticism in itself becomes the object of suspicion. In contrast, even at its most abstract, the concept of the negative can be justified as resistance, even if abstractly it does not possess its own positive aspect. This lies in what is negated. But what is at issue is determinate negation, that is, the immanent critique that confronts the concept with its object, and vice versa. Negativity in itself is not a good, that would be a bad positive, otherwise nothing but the vanity about standing above the objects because one is not in them. Warning against narcissistic misuse. Negativity towards one's own. Perhaps there is even a positive movens, but it may not express itself. Prohibition on images. That is, it must not postulate itself. The fixed, positive must not be denied, but it is purely an aspect, cannot be reduced to this. In Hegel, the positivity of the dialectic is at the same time its premise, that is the subject, spirit, and its telos, it carries the system. This results in two questions that I must try to answer by developing this line of thought. Is negative dialectics at all possible? That is, what is the source of determinate negation without the positive postulation guiding it? On this point, what is the product of the negation of the negation? My reply, always a bad positivity, index falsi. The gravest reservation to concept of synthesis. Incidentally, in Hegel, the so-called synthesis, which plays an astonishingly minor role in his texts, is not simply the better and higher, but the self-assertion of the thesis in the antithesis, the expression of non-identity, in this respect not so very different from empirical philosophy. Difference of nuance, these are crucial in philosophy. Intro. 3a is there, and this is the same thing, differently worded, a dialectics without system. Benjamin's thesis and its task. November 16th, 65. Since these lectures are entitled Negative Dialectics, I may perhaps be allowed to cast one further glance at the concept of positivity in the form it currently possesses. I believe that I already pointed out to you last time that the concept of positivity in itself, in abstracto, has become part and parcel of ideology today, and that critique in itself has started to become suspect, regardless of its content. In the final analysis, setting particular problems to one side and focusing for once on the larger philosophical architecture, it is this fact that has induced me to talk to you about negative dialectics. Now it would be quite false and superficial, and something I would like very much to prevent, if you were to restrict the phenomenon under discussion to the dominant attitude towards positivity, and together with that towards negativity as well. What we are considering here is a process that can probably be followed throughout the length and breadth of contemporary attitudes, namely, a process to which the concept of reification can be said to apply. This concept is one that I very much hope to be able to articulate fully for once, and to expound to you at a theoretical level, even though it may be thought to be more of a sociological task than a philosophical one. What I mean by this, and it is perhaps not entirely unimportant for you to have me draw your attention to this, is that concepts, and here we have already reached the theme of dialectics, are no longer measured against their contents, but instead are taken in isolation, so that people take up attitudes to them without bothering to inquire further into the truth content of what they refer to. For example, if we take the concept positive, which is essentially a concept expressing a relation, we see that it has no validity on its own, but only in relation to something that is to be affirmed or negated. Then we find that simply because of the emotional values that it has acquired, that have accumulated around the word, the term is wrenched out of the context in which it has validity and is turned into an independent and absolute thing, the measure of all things. In a similar way, as I pointed out in my introduction to the senior sociology seminar last week, the great controversy about intellectuals that is such a popular topic of debate nowadays has been conducted in such a way that people have discussed the intellectual as an anthropological, spiritual, or moral type, without inquiring about the intellectual issues that are at stake, or whether intellectuality in the succinct sense is the organ by means of which we perceive ideas adequately, and so forth. I have the impression that this tendency on the part of a reified consciousness to bring all the concepts in the world to a standstill simultaneously and to fetishize them, much as happens with the headlines in advertisements, that this tendency is all the more damaging as its universal prevalence prevents people from becoming properly aware of it. And I would take the view that the work of philosophy is concerned not so much with negativity as such. I shall have something to say on this question shortly, as that each person should keep his own thinking under surveillance and regard it with a critical eye in order to resist this reified way of thinking. And if I were to formulate in what way a negative dialectics should come to the assistance of your own thinking, and after all, such a goal is by no means contemptible. In a course of lectures I would see its benefit in bringing this tendency to your attention and preventing you from succumbing to it by making you aware of it. This tendency can of course be traced back very far, both socially and in the history of philosophy. Its principal cause is undoubtedly the irrevocable loss of absolutely binding uniform categories. This means that the less the mind possesses predetermined so-called substantial unquestioned meanings, the more it tends to compensate for this by literally fetishizing concepts of its own devising which possess nothing that transcends consciousness. In short, it makes absolutes of things it has created, and it achieves this by tearing them from their context and then ceasing to think of them further. Now I would say that, in the light of this situation, the concept of the negative is not without a certain value, even in the abstract and hence misleading way in which I have been obliged to introduce it. Its value is its right to resist such habits of thought, even if it does not have a positivity of its own. For it is precisely this having something, having it as something fixed, given and unquestioned on which one can comfortably rely, it is this that thought should actually resist. And the very thing that appears as a flaw in a philosophy that does not have this quality is in truth the medium in which philosophical ideas that are worthy of the name can thrive. If we start by thinking quite simply of the position of subjective consciousness, in other words, of the intellectual behavior of each one of us, we could say that such resistant thinking contains positivity in its resistance to the very elements I have attempted to explain to you with the concept of the reified consciousness. But I believe that, if you wish to grasp what I am aiming at, but am forced to explain to you in stages, you should be clear in your minds from the outset that we are not speaking here about negativity as a universal abstract principle of the kind that I was initially forced to develop, or not to develop, but that I placed at the start of my argument, because I had to start somewhere, even if I do not believe in an absolute beginning. Instead, the negativity I am speaking about contains a pointer to what Hegel calls determinate negation. In other words, negativity of this kind is made concrete and goes beyond mere standpoint philosophy by confronting concepts with their objects, and conversely, objects with their concepts. Negativity in itself, if such a concept were not nonsensical, since by virtue of its being in itself a concept that exists essentially only in context, that is for others, turns into its own opposite negativity in itself, is not a good to be defended. If it were, it would be transformed into bad positivity. And this false idea of negativity in itself is reflected in the vanity of a particular attitude which proves very tempting for young people, particularly if they have not yet been fully initiated into the relevant disciplines. The attitude that emerges is one that Hegel referred to in a celebrated passage in the preface to the Phenomenology, one I constantly allude to and which I would urgently like to recommend for close study by all of you who attend these lectures. Hegel speaks in the preface about the vanity and vacuity of anyone who stands above the main issues because he is not inside them. The abstract negativity involved in instantly sniffing out the defects of phenomena, from the outside as it were, in order to be able to assert one's own superiority to them, serves merely to gratify one's own intellectual narcissism and is therefore open to abuse from the outset. and resisting this temptation is surely among the primary requirements of the discipline of dialectics, one that cannot be overemphasized even though it does contain a productive element. This is our dissatisfaction with what we are being fobbed off with. We feel we are better than the swindle that is being foisted onto us. I have no wish to deny this. Nevertheless, we cannot allow this to be the end of the story, and this is what is implied in the call for determinate negation. A further implication is that such a mode of thinking also imposes the obligation to reflect ceaselessly on oneself. I should like to say at this point that among the objections that have been urged against my ideas, and they are very numerous, that is to say, if people can think of nothing better, and unfortunately, in general, nothing much does occur to them, they say, does he also apply the principle of negativity to his own ideas? This is a classical instance of what I call a bad abstraction. The issue is not that I should take an a priori negative attitude towards my own writings simply because I am critical of all sorts of phenomena, in accordance with a very specific and thought-out theory. After all, if I believed that my own ideas, which in fact constitute themselves only through a process of determinate negation, were in general mistaken or untrue, then I would not bother expressing them. The fact that I do express them means that I have put as much self-reflection into them as I am capable of. But it would make matters all too simple for my critics if they could just join this discussion from outside with the demand that, well, if he has got a negative principle, or if he thinks negativity is such an important matter, then he ought really to say nothing at all. I can answer such critics by saying only that they should be so lucky. I mean to say that in all probability, and this is as far as one can go in this respect, there is perhaps a so-called positive motive force of thought. If one does not wish it, and I say it intentionally because the it cannot be expressed well, this means that there can be no determinate negation because there won't be anything at all. But I believe that precisely this aspect of positivity, which acts as a corollary to negativity, is conjoined with the principle of negativity because it resists being fixed once and for all in an abstract, static manner. If it is true that every philosophy that can have any claims at all to the truth lives from the ancient fires, that is, it secularizes not just philosophy, but also theology, then we have identified here, or so I believe, an outstanding point in the secularization process. It is the fact that the prohibition on graven images that occupies a position of central importance in the religions that believe in salvation, that this prohibition extends into the ideas and the most sublime ramifications of thought. Hence, to make this quite clear, the issue is not to deny the existence of a certain fixed point. It is not even to deny the existence of some fixed element in thought. We shall in due course, I hope, come to discuss the meaning of such a fixed element in dialectical logic in very concrete terms. But the fixed positive point, just like negation, is an aspect, and not something that can be anticipated, placed at the beginning of everything. You may well ask me about what I said earlier on. If you admit that the positive, like the negative, is no more than an aspect, and that neither may be regarded as an absolute, why then do I privilege the concept of negativity so emphatically? If you did put this question to me, I would say that I can give you a proper answer only after you have seen a full account of the matters we have only begun to explore, and in particular if I succeed in providing you with a cogent and imminent critique of the premises of traditional thought with their roots in identity philosophy. I must therefore ask you to be patient. I cannot provide you with a proper answer at this moment. However, for practical purposes, from the point of view of our ordinary experience, I would say that the world simply overflows with positivity, and that this positivity itself turns out to be negative to such a degree that, faced with such negativity, it behooves us to assume the attitude that is defined by the concept of a negative dialectics. This is in fact very different from Hegel, a difference that cannot be obscured cosmetically. It is a difference that is not confined to so-called general attitudes, but extends into individual features. For infinitely rich though Hegel is, and however much every serious philosophy has to learn from him, It is not possible to overlook the differences, particularly at this juncture, or to dismiss them as the superficial differences of systematic approach. In Hegel, the positive nature of dialectics, in other words, the fact that the whole, the quintessence of all negations, is the positive, the meaning, reason, indeed the Godhead and the Absolute, is the premise that actually sets the dialectic in motion. By the same token, it is also the result that is supposed to emerge, and emerge inexorably, from this dialectic. And this circular procedure was one of which Hegel was particularly proud. He therefore made use of the circle as an image with which to compare his philosophy. And we might well also take up the analogy provided by a term from a completely different sphere, namely that of mathematics, a term probably formulated first by Henri Poincaré, who said that, rightly understood, Hegel's entire philosophy was a gigantic tautology. That would be all very well were it not for the fact that his philosophy desired to have it all, that it was unwilling to make any sacrifices, that there was no concept that was so incompatible with itself that it would have been prepared to refrain from devouring it and claiming it for itself. In short, on the one hand, this philosophy presented itself as a gigantic analytical proposition, but on the other hand, it claimed simultaneously to be the synthetic proposition par excellence. In other words, it claimed that this analytical proposition captured in the mind that which is not itself mind, and identified with it. It is precisely this twofold claim, the assertion that something can simultaneously be both a synthetic and an analytical proposition, that marks the point at which I believe we have to go beyond Hegel if we are to take him seriously. And there is no better way to show him respect than to take him utterly seriously. It is here that critical thinking and Hegel have to part company, and it is here that I identify right from the start the point at which I differ from the form he gives to dialectics, a form that even so I regard as not only the most consummate form attained to by dialectics, but also the greatest achievement of philosophy as such hitherto. Now, what I have attempted to outline to you up to now leads us to two questions, to which I hope to be able to provide some answers by developing further my line of thought, and which I would ask you to think of as thematic in these lectures. The first question is a negative dialectics at all possible? Can we speak of a dialectical process if movement is not brought into play by the fact that the object that is to be understood as distinct from spirit turns out itself to be spirit? Where then are we to look for the source of determinate negation in the absence of the positive postulate to accompany it from the outset, namely the postulate of spirit in which everything is included? We could also approach this question by inquiring, and this is a question I have already touched on, what this would mean for what Hegel calls the negation of the negation. I should like to answer this by saying that the negation of the negation is not simply the positive, but that it is the positive both in its positive aspect and in its own fallibility and weakness, in other words, its bad positivity. We might say, therefore, or rather it is a methodological principle, if I may speak of such a principle for once without your pouncing on me like vultures and claiming that I do have a general methodological principle after all. The issue is not whether one has any fixed or universal principles, but the standing, the function of such principles in the context of a philosophy. So we might perhaps say, this is a formula I have already tried out on earlier occasions, that the Spinozist proposition, one very characteristic of identity philosophy, that verum index sui et falsi, in other words, that the true and the false can both be directly read off from the true, is a proposition whose validity we cannot accept. But that the false, that which should not be the case, is in fact the standard of itself, that the false, namely, that which is not itself in the first instance, that is not itself in the sense that it is not what it claims to be, that this falseness proclaims itself in what we might call a certain immediacy, and this immediacy of the false, this falsium, is the index sui atque veri. So here then, although we shouldn't exaggerate it, is a certain pointer to what I consider right thinking. Now, what I have been suggesting implies the gravest possible objections to the concept of synthesis. And I have to confess to you that I cannot help myself. My intellectual reactions are instinctive. I react, as it were, with my nerves. And so-called theoretical thought is to a great extent no more than the attempt to pursue intellectually the path taken by these instinctive reactions through the mind. If you happen to read the little article on philosophical thinking I recently published in the Neue Deutsche Hefte, you will be able to understand better just what I have in mind. At all events, from very early on, I have always felt a violent antipathy to the concept of synthesis, and without my knowing what it meant, initially at least, it was probably no more than an act of resistance on my part. I was someone who tended to extremes, who detected something false in syncretism, and who instinctively objected to happy mediums following Arnold Schoenberg, who had written that the middle road is the only one that does not lead to Rome. At any rate, I believe that in my attitude to the negation of the negation, which according to the triadic scheme is what a synthesis actually is, my instinctive antipathy has at least been properly conceptualized. At the same time, I should like to draw your attention to the fact that the status of synthesis in Hegel is actually somewhat anomalous. The fact is that when you read the texts closely, you find that there is much less said about such syntheses, such positivities, than you might expect initially. And I believe that if you were to trace Hegel's use of the term synthesis, synthese, purely lexically as opposed to the concept of synthesis, as used by Kant in his epistemology, you would find that it occurs very rarely indeed, in contrast to such concepts as positing, Setzung, position, or negation. And this tells us something about the situation. It is grounded in the subject matter. It is no merely external trait of Hegelian language. In the three-stage scheme, if we allow for once that such a thing is to be found in Hegel, the so-called synthesis that represents the third stage, as opposed to negation, is by no means simply better or higher. If you consider an example of such a three-stage dialectic, we might look at the famous triad of being, nothing, and becoming. You will find that this so-called synthesis is actually something like a movement of thought, of the concept, but one that turns backwards and does not look forward and produce something complete to be presented as a successful achievement on a higher plane. Hegelian syntheses tend, and it would be rewarding to follow this up with detailed analysis to take the form that the thesis reasserts itself within the antithesis, once this has been postulated. Thus, once the identity of two contradictory concepts has been reached, or at least asserted in the antithesis, as in the most famous case of all, the identity of nothing with being, this is followed by a further reflection to the effect that, indeed, these are identical. I have indeed brought them together. Being, as something entirely undefined, is also nothing. However, to put it quite crudely, they are not actually entirely identical. The thought that carries out the act of identification always does violence to every single concept in the process. And the negation of the negation is in fact nothing other than the anamnesis, the recollection of that violence. In other words, the acknowledgement that, by conjoining two opposing concepts, I have on the one hand bowed to a necessity implicit in them, while on the other hand I have done them a violence that has to be rectified. And truth to tell, this rectification in the act of identification is what is always intended by the Hegelian syntheses. This structure, we are speaking here of a structure of dialectics. This structure is not something that can always be strictly sustained, and I know very well that you could show me quite different structures in Hegel's logic, but I would venture the claim that the intention is always this intention. And incidentally, this has the remarkable consequence that the movement of thought which enables us to characterize dialectics as a radically dynamic mode of thought is by no means always a forward movement, a unidirectional movement, but is always also a backward movement that always incorporates within itself, at any rate in its intention, the very things from which it distances itself. Moreover, one of the most astonishing features of the Hegelian dialectic, and one that is especially hard to grasp, is that, on the one hand, categories are ceaselessly promoted as things that are changing and becoming, while, on the other hand, they are logical categories, and as such, simply have to retain their validity, as in any traditional logic or epistemology.
However, if that is the case, then the reason for it lies precisely in the fact that, thanks to this retrograde tendency implicit in the forward movement, whatever advances is simultaneously laid to rest, so that becoming and being are also identical in this sense too. This at any rate is the intention of the Hegelian dialectic. So if what I have said is correct, that is, if the so-called synthesis is nothing but the expression of the non-identity of thesis and antithesis, it follows that such an expression of non-identity is not so very far removed, not exactly worlds away, from what I meant by the concept of a negative dialectics as it might have seemed at first glance, and even after my general description of it. And we see from this that the distinctions, and this is actually the great demand that philosophy makes on its adepts, the distinctions that really count in philosophy are not the distinctions to be drawn between large-scale opposing positions. This is something I have adverted to on a number of occasions in earlier lectures, but I may perhaps be allowed to repeat it in the hope that it may be of assistance to you in your own studies. If you compare the great systems with one another, for example, the rationalism of which Descartes was the preeminent exponent with Francis Bacon, the founding father of empiricism, you will find that on countless issues they not only say exactly the same thing, but that they actually mean the same thing, albeit making use of different conceptual tools. The intentions of these philosophies lie much closer to each other than might be expected from their general philosophical or axiomatic positions. But the crucial differences are to be found precisely in such minimal nuances as the distinction between the concept of synthesis in Hegel and the version of the concept of negative dialectics that I have been at pains to formulate. The differences are to be found in such minimal nuances, and the ability to think philosophically is essentially the ability to experience the large-scale implications of these seemingly minute differences. I have told you of the questions that I feel it is incumbent upon me to answer through this method, however indirectly. The question of the possibility of a negative dialectics leads me to a second question, one that differs from the first one only verbally, but is not so terribly different in point of substance. This is the question of whether dialectics is possible without system, and beyond that, whether you can have philosophy without system. The concept of philosophical system has long since been discredited, first of all by Nietzsche's statement, with which you are all familiar, about the dishonesty of systems, and even more so by the efforts of the various neo-Kantian epigones, such as Heinrich Richter's so-called open system, in which the discrepancy between the conceptual apparatus and the claims made by his philosophy is immediately obvious. In consequence, no very great act of intellectual courage is required to declare that one is opposed to system. And today, when no one with any ambition will have any truck with systems, it is almost better to inquire whether philosophy is possible without systems than simply to continue to assure everyone in sight that no system is possible. What I'm attempting here and would like to show you is the possibility of philosophy in an authoritative sense without either system or ontology. That is what I am aiming at. But to give you an idea of the serious import of these matters, I may perhaps conclude by saying that a thinker like Benjamin, who enjoys the reputation of an essayist and microanalyst, vigorously defended the idea that philosophy is not possible in the absence of system. This essay is to be found in the volume of Zeugnisse, Testimonies, and the thrust of his thinking actually pushed this question of the possibility of philosophy without system to the point of a sort of catastrophe. It is a question in which we shall have to immerse ourselves deeply in the course of these lectures, but with the twist previously referred to, that is to say, in the light of the received wisdom that a philosophical system is not possible.